The banker had already decided who would own the ranch. He had the deepest pockets. He had the lawyers. He had the support of 3 wealthy ranchers standing behind him. And most importantly, he had already told the auctioneer exactly how high he was willing to bid. Then, 5 minutes before the auction began, a 27-year-old mechanic stepped out of a dusty pickup truck and walked onto the property. He wasn't dressed like a rancher. He wasn't carrying a briefcase. He didn't even look like he had enough money to buy a tractor. But he stopped beside the old barn, stared at the ground for nearly 30 seconds, and then whispered something that would make the banker drop his bidding card completely. Nobody understood what the young mechanic had seen. Not yet. And if the auctioneer had sold the ranch that morning, the discovery might have been lost forever. Montana, October 1984. The ranch was called Black Creek Ranch. For nearly 60 years, the property had belonged to the same family. But by the fall of 1984, the ranch was drowning in debt. 2 years of poor cattle prices had taken their toll. A failed irrigation pump had crippled the hayfields. The north pasture had gone nearly useless, and when the bank called in the family's remaining debt, there was only one thing left to sell: the ranch. The property contained almost 640 acres, an old farmhouse, 2 barns, several cattle pens, a machine shed, and a weather-beaten windmill that hadn't worked properly in years. To most people at the auction, it was a failing piece of land. To Elias Carter, it looked different. Elias was 27 years old. He made his living repairing tractors, combines, irrigation pumps, and old diesel engines from a tiny workshop outside Billings. He hadn't come to buy the ranch. At least, that's what everyone assumed. He had come because the ranch's owner, Walter Hayes, had asked him to look at an old tractor before the auction. Walter had died 3 months earlier. His daughter, Margaret, was now being forced to sell everything. Elias had repaired equipment for Walter for almost 4 years. And there was one thing Walter had always told him: never trust what dead machinery tells you until you understand why it stopped. Elias had laughed the first time he heard it. He wouldn't laugh that morning, because when he walked behind the machine shed, he noticed something that made him stop. A pipe, half buried in the dirt, and it shouldn't have been there. Elias didn't know it yet, but that pipe would eventually become the reason the wealthiest man at the auction refused to buy the ranch. But first, he had to figure out where it led, and he had less than an hour. At 9:15 a.m., the first vehicles began arriving. Pickup trucks, Cadillacs, farm equipment trailers. Then came the bankers. One of them was Richard Hale, a 58-year-old regional banker from Helena. Hale had financed dozens of ranches across Montana. He had a reputation for buying distressed properties through other investors and reselling them after improvements. Black Creek Ranch was supposed to be another easy acquisition. His plan was simple: buy the ranch cheaply, repair the irrigation system, sell part of the property, keep the rest. He expected to make hundreds of thousands of dollars. Standing beside him were 3 investors. They were already discussing where the new cattle pens would go. Nobody was worried. The ranch looked finished. Then Hale noticed Elias. The young mechanic was crouched near the machine shed. Hale watched him pick up a handful of dirt. Elias rubbed it between his fingers. Then he looked toward the old windmill. Hale frowned. "Who is that?" One of the ranchers shrugged. "Local mechanic." "Is he bidding?" "Doesn't look like it." Hale smiled. "Good. Because the last thing he wanted was someone who actually understood the property interfering with his plans." At 9:40, Elias walked back toward the farmhouse. Margaret Hayes was standing on the porch. She looked exhausted. Her father's old ranch coat hung loosely around her shoulders. "You found something?" she asked. Elias hesitated. "I found something." "Bad?" "I don't know yet." Margaret looked toward the auction crowd. "Can it save the ranch?" Elias looked at the barn, then the windmill, then the machine shed. "Maybe." She stared at him. "Maybe isn't enough." Elias lowered his voice. "Your father knew something about this place." Margaret's expression changed. "What do you mean?" "Every time I repaired something here, he asked me the same question." "What question?" Elias looked directly at her. "Did you check where the water went?" Margaret had never understood what her father meant. Neither had Elias. Until that morning, there was an old water system beneath Black Creek Ranch, but nobody had used it in decades. And Elias had just discovered evidence that someone had deliberately hidden it. The question was why. The auctioneer climbed onto the platform at 10 o'clock. The crowd gathered. The banker stood near the front. Elias remained at the back. The auctioneer began listing the property. 640 acres, barns, house, equipment, livestock facilities, water rights. At those final two words, Elias looked up. Water rights. He knew something the bidders didn't. The ranch's visible irrigation system was almost worthless, but water rights in that part of Montana could be extraordinarily valuable. And if the old system still connected to an underground source, the ranch wasn't bankrupt. It was mispriced. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was something Walter Hayes had given him 6 months earlier. At the time, Elias thought it was an old repair diagram. Now he realized it wasn't. It was a map, a rough hand-drawn map of the ranch. 3 circles were marked near the northern pasture, and beside them were 4 words. Don't let them dig here. Elias stared at the paper. Then he looked toward Richard Hale. The banker was smiling. He knew exactly how much he intended to pay. Elias folded the paper, and for the first time that morning, he decided he might actually bid. The bidding started at $180,000. Nobody moved. The ranch had too many problems. The auctioneer lowered the opening price. $150,000. A rancher raised his card. $155,000. Another bidder followed. Then Richard Hale raised his card. $175,000. The crowd went quiet. Hale looked completely comfortable. He had already won. Then Elias raised his card. A few heads turned. The auctioneer stared at him. Bidder number 14. Hale slowly looked over his shoulder. The young mechanic, Hale almost laughed. $180,000. Elias raised his card again. $185,000. A rancher dropped out. Then another. Hale's expression hardened. $190,000. Elias didn't hesitate. $195,000. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That kid doesn't have that kind of money." Hale heard it. So did Elias. The banker raised his card again. $200,000. Elias looked toward the old windmill, then toward the northern pasture, and raised his card. $205,000. What Hale didn't know was that Elias wasn't really bidding against him. He was bidding against something hidden beneath the ranch. And when Hale finally understood what it was, he wouldn't raise his card again. Hale leaned toward his attorney. "Find out who is backing him." The attorney shook his head. "We don't know." "Then find out." The bidding reached $220,000. Elias remained calm, but inside, his confidence was fading. He didn't have $220,000. He had nowhere near it. His entire plan depended on one thing, proving what was underneath the northern pasture before the auction ended. So while the auctioneer continued calling bids, Elias stepped away. The crowd barely noticed. He walked behind the barn, then toward the old windmill. He found the pipe again. This time, he followed it. 10 yards, 20, 30. It disappeared beneath a mound of earth. Elias knelt. He scraped away the dirt. There it was, a rusted metal access cover. He pulled. It wouldn't move. He tried again. Nothing. Then he noticed 4 fresh scratches around the bolts. Someone had opened it recently. Elias froze. If the system had been abandoned for decades, who had been down there? He looked back toward the auction. Richard Hale was watching him. Their eyes met. Hale's smile disappeared. Elias suddenly understood why the ranch had been allowed to collapse. Someone had known about the hidden water system. Someone had deliberately kept it out of the auction records. And if Elias was right, Black Creek Ranch wasn't worth $200,000. It could be worth millions. But there was one problem. The banker had just discovered that Elias knew something. And Richard Hale was not about to let a 27-year-old mechanic walk away with his biggest acquisition of the year. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $225,000. Do I hear 230? Elias looked at the banker. Hale slowly raised his bidding card. And this time, he wasn't smiling. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $225,000. Do I hear 230? Richard Hale slowly lifted his bidding card. 230. The crowd murmured. Only minutes earlier, the banker had seemed certain he would walk away with the ranch. Now his eyes never left Elias Carter. The young mechanic stood beside the old windmill, staring at the rusted access cover. Hale knew something. He just didn't know how much. 235, Elias called. Hale immediately answered. 240. The auctioneer grinned. 240,000. Do I hear 245? Elias looked toward Margaret Hayes. She was standing near the farmhouse porch. Her face was pale. She knew what was at stake. If Elias lost the ranch now, the secret beneath it could disappear into someone else's hands. Elias raised his card. 245. Hale smiled. 250. The crowd gasped. A ranch that had been considered nearly worthless that morning was suddenly worth $250,000. But Elias wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the scratches around the access cover. Someone had opened it, recently, and if that person had discovered what was beneath the ranch before the auction, then the auction itself might have been based on a lie. Elias waited until the auctioneer paused. Then he walked back toward the windmill. He found a rusted wrench inside the machine shed. After several minutes of struggling, the bolts finally turned. The metal cover lifted with a loud screech. A narrow shaft descended into darkness. Cold air rushed upward. Elias froze. He could hear something. Water. Not much, but enough. He climbed down. About 12 feet beneath the ground, he found an old concrete chamber. And inside that chamber was a pipe system, unlike anything he'd seen on the ranch. The pipes were old, but not broken. A valve sat in the center. Someone had shut it deliberately. Elias wiped the dirt away from a metal plate. There was a date stamped into it. 1947. Beneath the date were 4 words. Municipal Water Reserve. Private Elias stared. Then his heart began pounding. This wasn't just a ranch water system. It was part of a much larger project. But why had nobody mentioned it? Elias searched the chamber. Behind the main pipe was a small metal box. Inside was a folded note. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter Hayes's. Elias opened it. It contained only one paragraph. Walter explained that his father had discovered the underground reservoir decades earlier. The reservoir extended far beyond the ranch boundaries. During dry years, it could provide enough water to keep hundreds of acres productive. But there was a problem. The county had never properly recorded the private water rights, and someone had been trying to purchase the ranch cheaply for years. Walter had refused, until the debts became impossible to survive. At the bottom of the note was one final sentence. If they sell Black Creek cheaply, they won't be buying dead land. They'll be buying the water. Elias read it twice, then a third time. Everything suddenly made sense. The dying pastures, the broken irrigation system, the abandoned windmill, the ridiculously low valuation. Someone had allowed the ranch to look worthless. Elias climbed back outside. Richard Hale was waiting. The banker stood with his hands behind his back. "You've been busy," Hale said. Elias didn't answer. Hale stepped closer. "You found the reservoir." Elias stared at him. That one sentence confirmed everything. "You knew?" Hale sighed. "I suspected." "How long?" 6 months. Elias's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you tell the other bidders?" Hale looked toward the auction platform. "Because nobody was interested in a failing ranch." Elias shook his head. "You were going to buy it cheap." "Of course. And then claim the water rights." Hale didn't deny it. "I was going to develop the property." "At whose expense?" Hale's expression hardened. "Don't make this about morality, kid. This is business." Elias looked toward the farmhouse. "No." He pointed toward the old barn. "This is about what Walter knew." Hale's expression changed. For the first time, he looked nervous. Elias walked directly toward the auctioneer. "Stop the sale." The crowd erupted. The auctioneer looked confused. "You don't get to stop my auction." Elias placed Walter's note on the table. Then he placed the old map beside it. Finally, he pulled the metal plate rubbing he'd made inside the chamber. "There's a water reserve beneath this property." Several people laughed. One rancher shouted, "There's no water under there." Elias looked at him. "Then why is the county's 1947 reserve plate still attached to the valve?" Silence. The banker stepped forward. "That proves nothing." Elias turned. "Then let's get the county engineer." Hale's face went pale, because he knew exactly what the engineer would find. The auction was suspended. For nearly 2 hours, everyone waited. The wind became stronger. Dust moved across the field. The bidders stood around in uneasy groups. Some wanted to leave. Others wanted to see whether the mechanic was right. Hale remained silent. Elias sat beside the farmhouse porch. Margaret joined him. "Did my father know all of this?" Elias nodded. "He knew enough." She looked down. "Why didn't he tell me?" Elias answered quietly. "Maybe he was trying to protect you." Margaret looked toward the banker. "From him?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. At 2:17 p.m., a county vehicle arrived. An engineer stepped out carrying equipment. He inspected the old map, then the access chamber, then the pipe system. For nearly 20 minutes, he said nothing. Finally, he came back outside. "There's water down there." Everyone stared. "How much?" The engineer looked toward the northern pasture. "That's the problem." He explained that the underground formation appeared to connect to a much larger aquifer. If the original documents were authentic, the ranch could possess valuable water access rights. But there was another surprise. The reservoir wasn't empty. It was still replenishing naturally. The old system hadn't failed. It had simply been shut off. The ranch hadn't been dying because there was no water. It had been dying because nobody was using the water beneath it. The auctioneer returned to the platform. The crowd gathered again. The ranch had transformed from a liability into one of the most valuable properties in the region. The bidding began. $250,000, $275,000, $300,000. Investors raised their cards. Ranchers competed. Hale remained still. The auctioneer looked at him. "Mr. Hale?" The banker shook his head. "No." The auctioneer blinked. "You're not bidding." Hale looked at Elias, then at the old farmhouse, then at the northern pasture. "No." He slowly lowered his bidding card. The crowd went silent. The banker who had been so confident an hour earlier had walked away, exactly as Elias had predicted. The price climbed to $340,000. Elias was still standing. Margaret looked at him. "You can't afford that." "I know." "Then why are you still here?" Elias smiled. "Because your father didn't ask me to buy the ranch." She looked confused. "He asked me to find out why the machines kept failing." Elias glanced toward the windmill. "Sometimes fixing the machine isn't the answer. You have to find what stopped it." Margaret finally understood. Elias hadn't come looking for a fortune. He had simply followed a mechanical clue. That clue had led him to water. The water had led him to the hidden documents, and the documents had revealed the true value of the land. The final bidder was a local ranching cooperative. They offered $355,000. Margaret accepted. But before the papers were signed, Elias asked for one condition. The cooperative agreed to preserve the old water system and make the recovered water available to neighboring ranchers during severe droughts. Margaret signed. Black Creek Ranch had been saved. Not by the richest bidder, not by the banker, not by a wealthy investor, but by a mechanic who simply refused to believe that broken machinery told the whole story. By 1987, Black Creek Ranch looked completely different. The northern pasture was green again. The cattle pens were full. The old windmill had been restored, and the underground water system supplied the ranch through the driest months. Farmers from neighboring counties came to see it. Some called Elias a genius. He always corrected them. "I just followed the evidence." One autumn morning, Richard Hale returned to the ranch. He walked toward Elias carrying a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the original water survey. Hale handed it over. "You were right." Elias smiled. "About the water?" Hale shook his head. "About the auction." He looked across the green pasture. "I thought I was buying a bankrupt ranch." He paused. "You were the only person there who realized the ranch wasn't bankrupt." Elias looked toward the old windmill. "No." He smiled. "It was just waiting for someone to fix the right thing." Years later, people still talked about the Black Creek auction. They remembered the banker. They remembered the wealthy bidders. They remembered the moment the auction stopped. But Elias remembered something else. The rusted pipe, the hidden valve, the note, and one sentence Walter Hayes had taught him years earlier. Never trust what broken machinery tells you until you understand why it stopped. Because sometimes, a broken machine isn't proof that something is worthless. Sometimes, it's a clue. And sometimes, the person everyone assumes cannot afford the opportunity is the only person who understands what it's really worth. If you enjoy stories about forgotten farms, mysterious ranches, unlikely heroes, and the hidden secrets buried in America's rural past, subscribe for more stories like this. Because the next abandoned farm might not be worthless either. It might simply be waiting for someone to look closer.